everyone, and welcome back to SAFC Fan TV. Apologies, we are just a few minutes later than we did anticipate. Thank you for waiting, but we are live now. Joining myself tonight is Sunderland player KIERON. KIERON, how are you getting on?
I'm very good, Jack. Jack, thank you very much for asking me on.
No, thanks for coming on, mate. A pleasure. The live chat is open tonight, so if you would like to ask KIERON anything yourself, get yourself in the live chat, read out as many comments as we can from there. I think a good place to start, though. Sunderland beating Wigan 3-0 at the weekend. Did you watch the game? Yeah, what did you make of it?
I didn't see the game, but obviously I was taking an interest in. I think I'd said on radio last week that it wouldn't surprise me too much if Sunderland were to go to Wigan and get something, despite the fact that their form has been so substandard of late. And I think getting an early goal can bring great confidence and help you get over any psychological barriers. And then, from all reports, it seemed they went from there, managed to stifle Wigan's threat, and then, of course, managed to add to it towards the end of the first half, and then, of course, another Ross Stewart penalty, sealed it for us. So you just hope that this is the launch pad for Alex Neil's managerial career at the Stadium of Light, and it's the beginnings of a corner being turned in terms of how the team perform.
Yeah. I mean, how does it happen in football? Because we've been, so poor as of late to then go and beat the side that's second in the league, 3-0 away from home. It was a completely unexpected result. How do you think that happens?
Well, often what happens is that even if you have a number of players who get off the team bus 90 minutes before kickoff who are short of confidence, there's always the opportunity that one, two, maybe more players can start the game in the right frame of mind with the necessary belief that they can get something. And then if somebody puts a good delivery in and somebody else gets on the end of it, then it can certainly help allay a lot of the fears and nerves that pre-existed, perhaps on the way to the stadium, and obviously based around such poor performances and outcomes quite recently. So many things in football can turn in a very, very short moment. It's a game of very tight margins. And at times, things like that can be instrumental in bringing about the necessary sea change. So the hope, of course, is that it's not a one-off. I would still have some concerns because I don't think you can go through a period like Sunderland have, where the performances and the results have been as abject as they have, without at least some underlying issues behind the scenes. So that now, of course, is the responsibility of Alex Neil and others to try and address, because ultimately the pressure is on him to make sure that what we see on a week-to-week basis is something that is much more and resembling what we think Sunderland should be in League One, and that is a club that sets the standards and hopefully can go on from now to the end of the season.
Yeah, I mean, we'll touch on there how, poor the form has been. I think since the turn of the new year, really, around Christmas time, we were flying, weren't we? Beat Doncaster 3-0 away from home, Sheffield Wednesday 5-0 as well, all towards the back end of December, really. And it was since the new year. I mean, that was only our second win of 2022 in probably about our 11th game or so. I mean, do you think there was anything that caused such a huge drop-off in our performances?
I would say it's indicative in many respects of Sunderland Football Club. And I think if somebody had the time and the inclination to look back over the course of the last 10, 15 years, you tend to see that quite often the players reap the rewards of a new manager coming in, but within a specific time frame, players start to become too comfortable, too content. And I think what that can do, or certainly has the potential to do, is lower the expectations and standards that may once have been all too evident when a new manager came in. So that's the challenge that Alex Neil has. Alex Neil's not the best or the most experienced manager to oversee development at the Stadium of Light in the last decade or so. but he has the responsibility now to try to rectify a lot of the issues that have pervaded the club for as long as they have. And he, like any manager, will probably feel that he has the necessary skill set to produce something much better, much more different. But, you know, it's only time that's going to tell. And even if Sunderland do go on and get promoted, and if they were to do that, it does seem much more realistic that it's going to happen through the playoffs.
Yeah.
Then the bigger challenge, not just for Alex Neil, but for the owners of the club and the people involved in overseeing the day-to-day running, then have the significant challenge of trying to make sure that they can, first of all, consolidate their place in the Championship, and then try to build something much more productive and meaningful for the future.
Mm-hmm. Do you have much confidence that going into the final, what must be about 11 or 12 games now of the season, that win could act as a little bit of a springboard, and, you know, we'll go into what's probably going to be the playoffs now in better form?
No, I wouldn't necessarily have a great degree of confidence. I think where you can take some grounds for optimism is that when you look at the run of home fixtures that they have, then with the exception of Rotherham, almost every single game at the Stadium of Light would be winnable in general terms. I think now, given the pressure that accompanies Sunderland's running, then it's really incumbent upon Alex Neil and his coaching staff to try to impress upon the players that they're going to have to produce some consistency. Yes, you can win occasionally when you don't play particularly well, but I do think to give yourself the best opportunity of, getting something on a week-to-week basis, they're going to have to be decent enough performances, because you know, it's been shown recently that, you know, Sunderland are susceptible at times, and including at the Stadium of Light. I mean, the atmosphere against MK Dons on a couple of occasions in the first half was increasingly toxic. And I personally, and I think most players would also testify to the fact that they don't mind when there's a collective jeer of disapproval at half-time because a first-half performance wasn't particularly good. But I think when there's booing during the game, that can be completely counterproductive. And obviously, Sunderland at the moment, you know, they don't really have anyone else to blame but themselves for the predicament that they found themselves in of late. But certainly when you look at the home fixtures, there's grounds for optimism. When you look at the performance on Saturday, and particularly the outcome, then Sunderland shouldn't be overly fearful about going to Charlton, going to Plymouth, going to Lincoln, etc. So it's all to play for. But I do think that automatic promotion would only come about with an unprecedented run of victories in League One. You know, they would probably have to win almost every single game to give themselves a chance of securing one of the top two positions.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of touched on there how the atmosphere can affect a player. As someone who's been there and done it and played professional football, how big of an impact does an atmosphere have? Because I think it divides fans. Some fans don't think it's too important, and some fans think that, you know, sometimes a crowd can even push the players on to changing the result entirely.
Well, I think when there's booing and jeering whilst the game is taking place, and especially when you have 30,000 plus within a stadium, and even if it's not every single person that's engaging in it, it certainly can have a detrimental effect. And I think that at times can be compounded when young players are involved. I mean, the MK Dons game recently, for me, was reminiscent of a lot of what I witnessed in the Championship season.
Yeah.
There was, you know, almost the anticipation of disapproval from the support. But that, in many respects, has culminated over recent weeks in poor performances and outcomes. And I know it's said by many supporters that as long as players give 100%, then there won't be any complaints. But that for me is a erroneous approach to have. 100% should be taken for granted, and not just in a physical sense when the players play, but in terms of the preparation and how they go about things. And I made mistakes when I was a young player, but unfortunately at Sunderland Football Club at the time, the culture around it was simply not conducive to being a successful, challenging club. So again, going back to the point I made earlier, it's Alex Neil that has to try to look at everything that's relevant, to try to even assess where Sunderland may have gone wrong in seasons past, and try to ensure that come May, at the very least, they're in either positions 3, 4, 5 or 6, and then to try to make sure they can capitalise on what is an irrefutable advantage, and that is having such a vocal, vociferous crowd that can be a springboard for players to perform well. And obviously, if you're doing that and they go into the playoffs in light of a good run of form, then they'll reap the rewards from what the support can bring.
Yeah. Before we get on to our next topic, just a quick look at the live chat. Hello to Andrew Clark, who says say hello to Eddie in Yeovil, big Sunderland fan. And Charlie S says, what does Kieran think of Jamie Tate? I think he could be our best signing in years to come, next to Ross Stewart, of course. So your opinion on Jamie Tate, Kieran?
Well, from what I've seen in the MK Dons game, he was certainly not only one of the bright spots, but arguably the bright spot. Now, on a day like that, it probably wouldn't have taken a great degree of effort, industry and innovation to have that particular status. But nevertheless, from what I've seen of him, he certainly looks like one of the better acquisitions that could be got from League One. He doesn't seem in any way perturbed about the change and the expectations and the pressures that would come from going from a club like Fleetwood Town to Sunderland. So to that end, it's very, very encouraging. Again, going back to a point I made earlier, you would just hope that he can be one who has got the personal objectives and aspirations to develop his career, and that almost regardless of what else is going on around the club and within the team or squad, that he can just have exclusive focus to his own development. But certainly the signs are very encouraging at this moment.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Tate, from what I'm saying to him so far. I think we need a bit of physicality in the middle. He seems to bring that. He seems to be quite hard to get the ball off. Can be quite strong in the tackle as well at times. A bit more of a physical option, I think, in the middle as opposed to just, technical ability, which you're saying, the likes of Dan Neil. I think he should be able to help us battle through games a bit more. And like you say, it all comes down to his own personal attitude, really, and how he develops. Callum Doyle was left out of the matchday squad at the weekend before a 3-0 win away at Bolton. Do you think that he needed a rest? Was that the right time to bring him out for a game?
Well, I know that the manager would be very guarded in his comments about any player, but I think that would be exacerbated when you consider the youthfulness of Callum Doyle. And I know it's kinder to put forward the idea that someone's been rested or someone's been rotated, but certainly based on what I'd seen in person at the MK Dons game, you can call it rested, rotated, omitted or dropped, but I would have had reservations about him playing in any of the subsequent games based on what I'd seen. Now, it might just be the angle that I was looking at him from, but he looked particularly slow and cumbersome. I think that, Alex Neil's obviously made the point that both his youthfulness is such that it's very difficult to ask him to play over a prolonged season. I don't necessarily buy into that. I think at times it gives people a convenient get out. But nevertheless, it might be difficult to ask for consistency over a prolonged period. Alex Neil also made the point that he's the only left-footed central defender, and therefore there was a reluctance to leave him out. I don't think that the problems I saw in that game and some of the problems that I've seen in previous games on television are anything to do with what his stronger or weaker foot is.
Yeah.
So it obviously didn't prove costly on Saturday, and unfortunately he might now be feeling that in looking at the performances and looking at results, that everything's changed in light of his omission from the squad. And I'm sure it's not as simple or as straightforward as that. But it won't do him or his career any harm if he now has to think about ways that he can try and work his way back into the starting 11, if indeed Alex Neil sees that as something he'll be doing in the short term.
Yeah, do you not think he's like, I mean, this is just my personal opinion. I feel as if at the start of the season, Callum Doyle looked really strong. Defensively, he looked pretty decent. I think him and Flanagan were creating a real good partnership. And on the ball, I thought he was great at playing out and getting the ball into the midfield, almost joining midfield at times as well. And as the season's progressed, I think he's got worse and worse. Do you think it could be a tiredness issue or a couple of mistakes have knocked his confidence, almost struggling to adapt to men's football?
There could be an element of that. And obviously now there's such an emphasis on defenders having sufficient skills with the ball at their feet. And whilst I understand that, and it's very much symptomatic of the modern game, I think people of my generation would still look to a defender's primary attributes being their ability to stifle and suppress a centre forward or the more creative and attack-minded players in the opposition. And when you look at Sunderland's defensive record over the course of the season, there is a real poverty in terms of the clean sheets that have been kept. And I think, MK Dons scored 2 a week ago on Saturday. Arguably, they could have scored more. And obviously, you look at other performances over the course of the season where he's been not the only figure playing defensively, but one of the central figures. So, I would always want my defenders to have a great degree of urgency about what they do, to have very good instincts, to have very good reaction times. And I would take all of those things if it meant that somebody wasn't as skilled on the ball as various other central defenders or fullbacks. Because I think, first and foremost, the idea is that at the end of the game, from a defensive perspective, it says Wigan 0 or Charlton 0 or Lincoln 0. And at times with a lot of modern football, it's okay when you've got defenders like Laporte at Man City or Virgil van Dijk at Liverpool or countless others that play at the very, very elite level. I think once you start trying to play from the back, certainly if you do it in such an extreme manner, at a lower level, the absence of quality could prove costly at some point. And it might not always be the defenders. It might be playing it into midfielders whose body shape isn't exactly what it should be. It might be players whose first touch isn't as good as you would expect at a higher level. So I think there's a lot to consider. But obviously, Alex Neil will feel vindicated based on what we witnessed on Saturday, not just in terms of winning the match, but also in relation to keeping a clean sheet.
Yeah, I mean, Alex Neil, of course, we just mentioned him there, did pick up his first win as Sunderland manager at the weekend. There were other names getting thrown about at the time. Rumour on the street was that Roy Keane was in there and rejected the club, as well as other names that were getting thrown about as well. What did you make of the appointment of Alex Neil in the end?
I think it's perfectly clear, irrespective of what the club says, that he wasn't first choice. In fact, it may be the case that he wasn't even second choice. I wouldn't be overly concerned about that because there's so many clubs have reaped the rewards of a managerial appointment, despite the fact that the person in question wasn't the ideal candidate from the perspective of the decision makers. I mean, the club has obviously tried to present itself now as being more progressive, much more aligned to the idea of a head coach as opposed to a traditional manager. And again, that would be symptomatic of many of the facets and features of modern football. Nevertheless, I think it's evident, and certainly evident from people that I've spoken with, that the job was Roy Keane's if he wanted it. And it obviously developed over time that Roy Keane either didn't feel he himself could join in with whatever it was that Sunderland were putting forward. And obviously Alex Neil was the person that they turned to. But Alex Neil has managed now for some time, and he's managed the clubs in England and been relatively successful. But I think that in the position that he's in, I don't think that he was in any position to turn down Sunderland Football Club, even if a lot of the conditions that are attached to the job were not exactly favourable, or certainly wouldn't have been agreeable to Roy Keane. So it's Alex Neil. There's nothing can be done about it now. I've got no doubt, will be studious. He'll be meticulous. He will work hard and try to make sure that he's doing his best to try to bring the short-term objectives to fruition, i.e. promotion. And then, of course, we'll make an honest attempt at trying to, have a good enough season, next season. But that, of course, is very much predicated on what will come from the ownership. The ownership of the club have not yet been put under any serious pressure from the support with regards to acquisitions of players. They've managed to get by with bringing in players that on first glance would seem to be good enough for Sunderland Football Club given where they are. They've certainly brought in players that you think from their previous clubs and careers would be more than good enough to play and prosper at League One level. But in saying all of that, it's been perfectly clear that you look at Will Grigg, you look at the acquisition of Danny Graham, there's still that toxicity and there's that unknown aura that can affect players who come to the Stadium of Light and for whatever reason are not able to replicate that which has been very visible at their most recent club or certainly throughout the large part of their careers. So, all of these things have to be considered, and I believe that these things have to be addressed whilst running in tandem with allowing Alex Neil to manage the football club. I think that you have to have people there whose time at the club is going to survive and surpass a managerial appointment, a football director of football, etc., etc. And, the whole issue with the managerial appointment became, in many ways, it became farcical. But sadly, for a lot of people that know this football club, it would seem typical. And it's sad to say that despite the fact that Sunderland's in League One and they're always going to occupy one of the leading positions in the league table, there's still that element of farce about this particular football club. And you obviously hope that a new owner, a new manager, a director of football, etc., either individually or working collectively, can be the catalyst for meaningful change. But I still have reservations as to whether that's the case.
Yeah, I mean, a big deal was made this season about a new recruitment model that was spoken of quite a lot, in particular by the director of football, Christian Speakman, where we were looking at younger players, supposedly more versatile players who could grow with the club. What have you made of the recruitment since the new ownership's taken over?
Well, first of all, you can dress it up as a new recruitment model that has an emphasis on players who are much more youthful and junior than their counterparts elsewhere. More cynically, you could look at it and say it's just a cheaper way of going about your business, because the players that they've managed to bring in many of whom have been at leading clubs in England, and of course the loanees from Bayern Munich, are coming in on a salary that generally would either reflect being substandard or, in this case, being young players. And of course, the more and more, you know, you can see it as admirable that there's such an emphasis on youth. And I would also point out that the emphasis on youth is one thing, but what's not really been considered is that it's actually been quite an insult to the academy at the club. The emphasis on youth has almost exclusively revolved around bringing in younger players from elsewhere rather than the promotion from within. Of course, there's exceptions, Dan Neil being a very good example, and of course, I think to a lesser extent, Elliot Embleton. But I think what was considered was that, yes, these players will have had experience and good grounding in coming from clubs like whether it's Leeds United or Everton or Spurs, etc., and of course Bayern Munich, perhaps the best example. But ultimately, I don't believe that it's proved fruitful so far. I believe that Sunderland's primary and almost only objective in the short term is promotion to the Championship. I think then you're in a much better position to create the impression that you're a club on the up, and that you'll bring in then a much more experienced and much more reputable group of staff, whether it's players, coaches, managers, etc. So I wouldn't wholeheartedly buy into this new model. And bear in mind, Jack, that recruitment is just a fancy new term for hopefully going out and bringing in good footballers. And I think it's fair to say that over the course of the last 5 years or so, Sunderland either haven't brought in good footballers or enough good footballers, or at times they've brought in footballers who were good at previous clubs, but who for one reason or another haven't been able to replicate that, certainly not on a consistent basis at Sunderland. There's one or two exceptions, of course. You know, like Ross Stewart at the moment is having a wonderful season. He's been a great buy, very much value for money. But it has to be seen in a much broader and wider context. So, you know, we're once again approaching the beginning of March. And I think what a lot of fans find has been completely unacceptable is that, to all intents and purposes, automatic promotion, even with a 3-0 victory against Wigan, even doing the double over Wigan, isn't going to be anywhere near enough to bring the necessary hope that come May, Sunderland will be in one of the automatic positions. And I mean, they'll, of course, if they do get promoted, they will go out and bring in new players. But based on what I've seen this season, whether it's in person or in relation to watching games, you know, as they happen on television, they would be up against it in a major way in the Championship. You know, and I'm not saying definitively, you know, that they would face relegation, but I think the problem they would have is that it would become very evident very early on that they were going to struggle. And I think then that has an adverse impact on the aspirations of people in the club and, of course, the supporters. And then you run the risk of everything becoming toxic again.
So do you think moving forward, obviously we'll have the next summer window, potentially as a League One, potentially as a Championship club. Do you think, you know, a better recruitment strategy will be to go for more experienced players who are more proven?
I think so. I mean, I know it was said that one of the conditions that was attached to Lee Johnson during his time was the attempt to try and reduce the average age of the squad. I think Sunderland, given many of the problems that pervade the club, would have been much better trying to bring a more significant degree of experience. Now, they might have lost out in terms of the sell-on value of a lot of players, but given the squad that they have at the moment, I certainly would be looking at the prospect of using Jermaine Defoe and using Patrick Roberts and using various others that have got a great degree of experience and winning psychological battles before you take to the field of play, because a lot of teams and a lot of individuals will get a huge lift when they receive news of Sunderland starting 11 at times and they see that Patrick Roberts or Jermaine Defoe hasn't made the starting 11. And of course, one of the difficulties you have in the modern game is that those particular players aren't getting the opportunity to either reach or maintain what's often termed as match fitness and sharpness, because there's no longer reserve football in the same way that there once was. So I don't know if Sunderland are going to reap any rewards from having Jermaine Defoe. I think that the club were weak in bringing him to the club. And I say that without knowing for certain that he would have been a failure. He's looked after himself very, very well. He's a wonderful example to young players. But he's only featuring in a very limited manner, and it's perhaps not allowing him the chance to feel as sharp as he could. But he's still got the quality, and if Sunderland are playing on the front foot and they're taking the initiative and they're creating chances, then there's very, very few you could think of that you would rather be in the positions to try to capitalise.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Jermaine Defoe there. Obviously, we signed him. It was a deadline day as well, obviously, a free agent. 39 years of age, haven't played, barely any football all season. Like it was 8 or 9 minutes across some substitute appearances. Do you think at all there's a lot of people being saying that they thought it was a more of a PR stunt? Do you buy into that at all? Because of the negativity around the club at the time, it was just to lift spirits among the supporter base?
I think there's an element of it, and Sunderland are not unique in that regard. I think it does happen from club to club, but I don't think it would happen at any of the leading clubs, any of the elite clubs, any of the clubs that challenge for leading and prestigious titles on a regular basis. I think that the club perhaps sensed that they were in a period of adversity, and this would allow for at least a fleeting moment where they could alleviate a lot of the concerns and the complaints coming from supporters. Now, that's not to say that because it has a public relations element to it, that it's not going to have any benefits in relation to what you produce as a football team. I still think that Jermaine Defoe could produce goals because that's ultimately what he's renowned for. But nevertheless, I think that bringing him to the club obviously had a risk element to it because of his age and the lack of game time. I also think that behind the scenes, it perhaps created some consternation between Lee Johnson and the powers that be, because I don't think from some of his comments during the period of January that he was wholeheartedly supportive of bringing him to the club. And of course, it flies in the face of any conditions that are attached to the football manager in terms of bringing the average age of the squad down. So what was it something that perhaps was taken from his decision-making powers? Perhaps. And obviously a lot of football managers don't like interference from elsewhere. They don't mind having recommendations from scouts, directors of footballs, but I certainly think that a lot of managers would like to be valued enough to be able to make the final decisions on the players that come to the club. I mean, it seems an incredible notion that you would have a board or even a director of football who would bring a manager to a club and then try to do what I believe is the manager's job. And you can understand at times why any manager, whether it's Lee Johnson or others, would view something like that with a great degree of contempt. In fact, he might even believe that his position is becoming increasingly untenable.
Yeah. Going into the final running of the season now before the playoffs start, I've got a little list here. So Danny Bart, Niall Huggins, Luke O'Nien, Aidan McGeady, and Nathan Broadhead are all amongst the names of players who are out with injuries or fitness issues ongoing. Which of those are you most excited to see return to the squad? Which one do you think will make the biggest impact going forward?
Well, I think that having Aidan McGeady back could be of huge benefit. And I think, in a sense, there's also the potential that you can take advantage of his long layoff. Because I think Aidan's now at an age and a time in his career where he understands that it's very much in the twilight of his footballing time, and he might want to make a strong, lasting impression in the last few months of what might be the last few months of his time. That self-confidence, he obviously has the ability. I think could be, he could be hugely important for Ross Stewart also. I think he could be beneficial for Jermaine Defoe as well. So I think the return of Aidan, if we get Aidan anywhere near what we witnessed last season, could be of huge benefit and significance. The other one I would say, whilst of course different in terms of their skill set, would be Luke O'Nien. And Luke O'Nien, as much as I believe there's limitations on his footballing ability, can act as a great example to people around him, particularly the new players who have come in January and won't have played alongside Luke O'Nien or seen what he brings to a team, because he's a wonderful example of a team player. And his 100% is very visible. It's very physical. It's very animated. It's almost theatrical at times. But that in its own is beneficial. But I also think that if you're playing alongside someone like that, and you see someone who's prepared to put themselves in physical danger, to run themselves into the ground, then it increases the chances that others alongside him will perhaps not replicate exactly what he does, but will be much more prepared to give that extra effort that they might not have been in recent games or recent weeks. So, and of course, I don't mean to be dismissive about any of the others, because Nathan Broadhead was beginning to make an impact, and he's obviously still young, but I certainly think that, and Luke O'Nien and Aidan McGeady have got the experience of being at the club, understanding the pressures, and of course being fully familiar with trying to pursue a promotion place at this time of the season.
Yeah. KIERON, we did ask some questions on social media from people. We got one, which is from Biggs Dark Rider, who says, asks, did yourself and Rushy really turn out for Hilton Castle Club whilst contracted to Sunderland? Is there any truth in that?
What's what?
Play for Hilton Castle Football Club whilst contracted to the club.
No, we enjoyed some social activities around there at times, but whilst contracted to the club, I would never have played in a game that would be amateur or semi-professional, etc. For one, it would be frowned upon. There would be the odd five-a-side game that I might have played in, perhaps to keep fit or just to participate through love of the game. But not to the extent that I would, turned up in a, whether it's a Sunday morning or a, whenever it was, and played. No, and the nature of my condition that stopped me playing is such that I couldn't really play football and without going through a lot of pain. So it's not something I've done. It's maybe something that's been embellished or exaggerated a little bit, even although I had a lot of happy times in the halcyon days of youth around Hilton Castle and Town End Farm, and places that I've got a lot of affection for and a lot of happy memories from.
Fair enough. It was just a question we got. I thought I may as well put it to you. Going back a little bit, maybe something we should have asked a little bit earlier. Of course, you know, I know this is a little bit outdated now, but the ownership news, the ownership situation of the club, there was some news regarding that a few weeks ago, which stated that KIERON Dreyfus only owned 41% of the club, with the three previous Madrox owners owning the rest of it. What did you make of that?
Deception. You know, I don't think there's any word for it. I think that the people who are the current custodians of the club were fully aware that there was a broad clamour from the support for information to be divulged, which would illustrate just who owned what particular percentage of the club. And we now find ourselves in an inexplicable position where it seems that there's a significant desire from many supporters that Kyrre Dreyfus buys out the remaining shares from Messrs Donald, Methven and Sartori. And whilst I can understand it on one hand, it's incredible that we find ourselves in a position where if that was to come to fruition, you're then going to have somebody who becomes the majority shareholder who was complicit in that deception over the course of the last year. And of course, all of this is added to by the sight of Charlie Methven in particular being in attendance at specific away fixtures. Of course, Charlie could argue that as someone who has a 5% shareholding in a football club, he's entitled to go to whatever game he chooses. And it's hard to argue. But in saying all of that, it's been badly managed. It just really reflects poorly on the people who are in charge of the club, and it completely detracts from the idea that the arrival of Kyrre Dreyfus and everything that went with it has not represented a clean sweep. It's not represented something that could be seen as all new. And it's something that is being diluted and something that muddies the waters. And I think that the only way, or perhaps one way, of trying to remedy it and trying to regain the trust and confidence of a lot of supporters is to bring about the new ethos that's, I believe, is imperative to allow the club to prosper. But of course, to placate and pacify a lot of concerned supporters, he will have to, come the summer transfer window, show significant willing to bring players of a certain standard to the club that will allow the club to, to go forward. And, I think he, by his actions, or in this case, his inaction and the silence that surrounded the demands of the supporters to know who owned what particular shareholdings, has put himself into the position now where it might take some time and it might take some effort and it might take some money to regain the trust that he is the person and he has the philosophy to drive the club forward and bring them back to a club that is, going to hopefully get to the Premier League again.
Yeah, a question that was thrown about on the channel last night by the lads and Emma who were on there last night, discussing that if we were to get promoted this season, whether that's via the playoffs or, of course, on the same chance of automatic promotion, do you think at all that it would take the pressure off, the current ownership and situation, and that the fans would, not be putting as much pressure on them, I guess, really?
It would. I know some people could argue, and it may be done in a harsh manner, that if they finished sixth and got promoted, it still doesn't reflect well in a club like Sunderland. I mean, I played for Sunderland when we finished sixth and very fortuitously got promoted. But by the time the new season began and we were playing in the top flight, very few supporters, if any, were overly concerned about how we got there. The primary fact and important reality was that we were there, and we could then set about trying to compete. So Lee Johnson, I'm sure if he'd managed to get the club promoted, Jack Ross, Phil Parkinson, etc., wouldn't have spent too much time dwelling on the fact that it came via the playoffs. The important thing is that they can get there, because whilst the club is languishing in League One, it just gives people the opportunity. And then, of course, it's added to by what happened recently with the managerial fiasco, to look upon Sunderland in many respects as a complete, unmitigated, irrefutable basket case. Because as much as a club like Sunderland are going to win a lot of fixtures in League One, the overriding question and the overriding view and opinion from people within the game is always going to be based around why a club like Sunderland are in League One in the first place, and why a club like Sunderland have taken 4 years at least to rid themselves of the status of being a League One club. And of course, it becomes unarguable that if you get promoted, you can say at a literal level, we are a club on the way up. But as much as I believe that that is an irrefutable fact, I don't think it tells you a truth, but it doesn't convey the whole truth and nothing but the truth. You know, the real litmus test for someone who is commonly reported as being a billionaire or having access to funds that would resemble it is going to be in what they're prepared to do in a financial sense to bring about some form of success.
Yeah, I think it would definitely naturally relieve the pressure a little bit, because naturally people are focused on the happiness and elation of being promoted and looking forward to future success. But I think at the first kind of sign of it going bad again, the finger will instantly be pointed back in that direction, and the negativity will be directed towards them again. I mean, is there anything in particular you think that KLD should do right now? Do you think that his mindset should be fully focused on buying the remaining shares?
Well, I've got no doubt he feels under pressure, because as a human being, as a young man, which he is, he will have experienced a significant degree of invective, either online or even in person, from Sunderland supporters over the course of the last 4 months. It's irrefutably been the most challenging period of the year or so that he has been in charge of the club. I think the potential problem that he has is that the shareholders who currently hold 59% of the club may feel that this is not the time for them to sell their shareholdings. They might be of the view that they would look more favourably at the idea of selling their individual shares when Sunderland are, at the very least, a championship club. What adds to the potential problem if Dreyfus is interested in acquiring those shares is that Charlie Methven, Stuart Donald and Juan Sartori will be fully conscious of the clamour from supporters to buy out their shareholdings. And as such, they might make it much more challenging in a financial sense to do it. So all of this is added to which something that is very much an unholy mess surrounding the club. It doesn't in any way, shape or form impact the players. You know, I know this is something that gets mentioned often. Footballers in the main don't care who owns a club. Footballers in the main care about whether they're paid and whether they play. It's almost an afterthought who is in charge of the club or who owns what particular shares. But all that said, when you look at what the club has went through over the course of the last 10 years or so, when you look at what the fans have endured, then you can understand the frustration of the broad support that all of these things are contributory as to why many people in football, whether it's players, coaches, managers, or even potential new owners and custodians, would hesitate at the prospect of getting involved with Sunderland Football Club. I think that the club has to become much more attractive within the game itself. You know, a lot of fans might not want to hear this, but I would say with the greatest confidence that when a footballer hears from an agent or from the club he's playing for that there's interest from Sunderland Football Club, I think a lot of them would respond with an attitude of apathy. You know, I don't think they would be enthused about it. The difference, of course, is when you go and bring players in like Jay Matete or Luke O'Nien, players that are plying their trade in League Two or League One, and where going to Sunderland represents a significant wage increase. But Sunderland shouldn't be judged around the reaction of young aspiring players in League One and Two to the prospect of going. Sunderland has been a halfway house for a lot of top players. It's been a destination when their career is stagnating. And all of these things have to be addressed, and all of these things have to be communicated to Carol Louis-Dreyfus. And if he doesn't have people to communicate with on a regular basis that understands these things, then he's going to have to do something different. And, you know, there's a place in football for a director of football. There's a place in football for analysts, academy directors, etc., etc. But Sunderland have had, I believe, a set of problems that almost have a uniqueness, and I don't believe can be remedied or rectified without local knowledge or without people being prepared to say things that the powers that be at the club might not ideally want to hear. Because the first step in bringing a problem to an end is recognising the problem in its absolute entirety. And Sunderland continuously fall for this idea that if results are not good enough, that they will make a managerial change. You know, and when I tried to communicate a lot of this to the club back in the spring of 2015, it wasn't as warmly received as I would have hoped. And that's when Sunderland were a Premier League club. They now face the prospect of being a League One club for the 5th successive season. And since this was communicated to the club, Sunderland have now went through 12 different managers that they've brought to the club thinking, this guy will be the one to change our direction. And, you know, it's a club it's a club that has basically been going nowhere slowly. You know, and it might be better if it was going nowhere fast, because at least you would get nowhere and you'd be able to turn around and take stock. But it's very difficult to know what direction the club is going in at this moment, you know, because, you know, the idea of, again, next season, fans looking at the fixture list in the middle of June and plotting the various respective pathways to Shrewsbury or, you know, Gillingham or Cheltenham and Morecambe. I mean, it just doesn't bear thinking about, you know. And I know at times like this you're meant to say, with respect to those clubs. Well, no, Sunderland need to stop being as nice. Sunderland really need to start thinking, we're Sunderland, we don't belong here. You know, and we're going to do everything within our power, you know, right across the board, including bringing innovative thinking into it, not just conforming to football narratives that are tired, in many respects antiquated. You know, trying to be fresh and ingenious with your thinking, and hopefully reaping the rewards of it.
Yeah. Quickly back to the live chat. This is a question that's pretty similar to what was asked right at the beginning by myself, saying there's no argument until Saturday that players had lost their mojo. KIERON, how do you think dressing rooms get the passion back after a bad run?
You know, I think going back to what I'd said earlier, you know, sometimes it can be the responsibility of the stronger characters, the senior players within the dressing room, to do something about that, to try to make sure that it is just a blip, what we've been going through. There's an element of kidology and psychology attached to it. And, you know, getting a free kick in a wide area after a minute or two and putting a very good delivery in can often be the catalyst to bring about that change. And at least then, the players that were hesitant, the players that had reservations, can all of a sudden think, well, here, you know, we're 1-0 up at Wigan, this team that have been very, very good of late. And then, of course, they've managed to go on and add to it. But without wishing to be despondent, you know, if you go back to the Championship season and you recall the Easter weekend fixtures and Sunderland going to Derby County, I believe on Good Friday evening or the Saturday before Easter, and getting an outstanding 4-1 victory against a Derby team that had many, many very good players. But unfortunately, the circumstances of the game allowed for it, rather than, as time and history proves, it being some sort of watershed moment that allowed Sunderland to go on and avoid relegation. So the challenge now for Alex Neil is to make sure that the players can do what's necessary to reproduce the outcome, you know, this Saturday against, I think it's Charlton away. If they can do that, the players look forward to next midweek when Fleetwood Town come to the Stadium of Light. And, you know, you feel much more confident. You can start the game high tempo. You can take the initiative. You can play on the front foot. And you can intimidate at least some of those Fleetwood Town players. Because the thing about Sunderland in League One is that with every game at the Stadium of Light, it's almost inevitable that at least one or two of the opposing players will never have played in front of a crowd of 30,000 plus. And, you know, I know it's a cliche within football, but the fans can be, you know, the 12th man, as is often said, or 12th women in women's football, because they can really encourage players. They certainly had a huge positive impact on me in the brief career I had in the game. But the downside of that is, of course, that some managers have become very adept at coming to the Stadium of Light and working out the best way to not only nullify the support, but to get the support to act in a way that would make you think Sunderland are possibly playing with 10 players rather than 11. So performing well at Charlton, hopefully getting 3 points, would be a great grounding, you know, for what's to follow, particularly next midweek.
Yeah, I mean, so you have got Charlton on the weekend, which you did mention there. After, of course, an unexpected 3-0 away victory at Wigan, is there anything you would change going into Saturday, or is it important to never change your winning team?
Well, I mean, I think obviously that would be for Alex Neil to decide, but I think if you're going to make changes, it has to be based around the performances over recent weeks. It can't be just about the result. It's too simplistic to think that because you won 3-0, we'll just do everything the same. You know, there's probably key points in the game where Wigan could have perhaps got back in it, and obviously you have to try and be mindful of defensive lapses, because it's a ludicrous idea to think that because you didn't concede, you can just do the exact same again. So I don't think there'll be many changes, and that of course might mean that there's not many personnel changes, but the important thing is that even if you make 1 or 2 changes, or even if you keep the same 11, that you try to instill the confidence in the players. You try to impress upon them that playing at the Stadium of Light is and should always be an advantage. And the way to try to maintain and reinforce that is to do things properly early in the game, to make sure that the crowd can react in a positive, vociferous and productive manner. And that's something Sunderland should be doing, whether they're playing in League One, whether it's the Championship next season, or, God willing, at some point in the not too distant future in the Premier League.
Yeah, one more question from the live chat then. Mad Mackham, essentially alluding to ex-Sunderland players, communicate with the club. When you were playing, did you listen to any of the old-timers, as he puts it, or did you not know at all?
Well, first of all, I hope the person posing the question doesn't mind, but I would take issue with the fact that I would refer to as a legend. I think that's part of the problem, that players who play for the club are afforded a status that they simply don't warrant. And I do not believe in any way, shape or form that I should ever be described as a legend. It's nice, I do appreciate it, but I think that this term legend should only be afforded to players who have contributed in a huge and significant manner. At times, yeah, I would, take on board the wisdom and experience of others. It wasn't always former players, but over time, I think you get to know the area, you get to know the people, you get to know the expectations. At Sunderland, particularly coming from the west of Scotland, one of the things that I enjoyed most was seeing how much the club meant to the local community. It's something that's very evident in Glasgow and surrounding areas, particularly regarding Celtic and Rangers. And then, of course, you learn about the history of the rivalry with Newcastle. So to that end, I probably didn't need many people to try to educate me about what a football club means to a solidly working class community. Now, I mean, I think a lot of people, a lot of owners at clubs nowadays would conform to the idea that football has taken on such a modern slant or a modern take that they can chart their own path. And obviously we live in a footballing world now where people talk about processes and projects. They talk about pathways and, various other terminology that's much more commonplace now. But what doesn't really distinguish from what's went before, it's Kyril Louis-Dreyfus and others that are operating within the highest corridors of power at the Stadium of Light that will stand or fall based on the decisions that they take for the advancement of the club. And unfortunately, within football, a lot of people try to simply accentuate the positives that are attached to any one particular football club. That's why you get so many ex-Sunderland players saying that they loved their time at the club. And you can understand it to a point, but the reality is that so many of the players that speak about loving their time at the club were also relegated when they played for this club. Were also part of teams that brought unwanted, shameful records to this club. And it kind of begs the question as to why they loved it as much when the team that they were playing for and the club that they were representing were incapable of or unable to do a lot better and perform in a way that I believe should reflect a club that has a stadium that holds almost 50,000 people and has a stadium that can accommodate a fan base that I believe is almost peerless in football.
Yeah. KIERON, I think that's pretty well we'll leave it there, but thanks very much for joining us. It's been a pleasure listening to you.
Thank you very much again for asking me, Jack. Thank you.
And thank you everyone who's watched as well. If you haven't already, please do like the live stream if you haven't done. Subscribe as well if you haven't done so you won't miss any of our future streams or videos. But for myself and KIERON, thanks for watching. Take care and we'll see you later. Bye-bye.